The devil had a forge, and he called it the Arizona Territory. In the summer of '81, the sun didn't just shine, it hammered the land flat, beating the life out of everything but the scorpions and the sin. It was in this godless anvil of heat and rock that a woman named Maeve O'Connell found a dying man. He was Apache, the enemy who haunted her waking moments and her dreams. And in an act of mercy that defied all reason, she lifted him from the dust, not knowing she was carrying a ghost, the most feared son of a great chief, a man with a bounty high enough to buy a town and a reputation bloody enough to burn one down. The silence of the desert was a living thing. It pressed in on Maeve O'Connell, a physical weight that matched the one in her heart. 3 days out from the burned-out shell of what was once her homestead, she was walking toward the faint promise of Prescott, a town she'd only ever heard of in whispers. She had a single canteen, a small sack of cornmeal, and a Henry rifle she barely knew how to use. What she truly carried was the ghost of her husband Daniel, killed 6 months prior in a raid that had painted her world in ash and blood. They'd called it an Apache raid. The word itself was a venomous spit on the tongue. Her worn leather boots scuffed against rust-colored rock and sand. Ahead, a cluster of buzzards circled lazily, their black shapes a cruel mockery of angels against the searing blue sky. Her first instinct was to shy away to conserve the dregs of her energy. But something, a flicker of the stubborn compassion that Daniel had both loved and cursed in her, pulled her forward. He was sprawled near the scant shade of a palo verde tree, a place where he'd clearly crawled to die. He was Apache, the high cheekbones, the long black hair matted with sweat and dirt. The faded buckskin leggings, it was all there. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. A dark, ugly stain spread across his side, the source a ragged hole from a rifle slug. Flies were already gathering. Every instinct screamed at her to run. This man was one of them. His kin, his brothers, were the reason Daniel lay buried under a simple wooden cross. His people were the specters that emptied saloons and sent shivers through lonely cabins at night. Turning away would be justice. It would be survival. But then he groaned a low, guttural sound of pure agony that cut through the layers of her hatred. His eyelids fluttered. For a fleeting second, his dark eyes opened, unfocused, and clouded with pain. They weren't the eyes of a demon from a campfire story. They were just the eyes of a man in his final moments. Maeve knelt her knees, cracking in protest. She'd been a healer of sorts back in County Cork, and the instinct was too deeply ingrained. She gently peeled back the tattered buckskin. The wound was bad, festering under the relentless sun. He'd be dead by nightfall. Damn you! She whispered the words, a harsh rasp in her throat. The curse wasn't for him. It was for her own conscience. It was for God, for Daniel, for this forsaken land that demanded impossible choices. She tore a strip from her petticoat, soaked it with a precious mouthful of water from her canteen, and began to clean the wound. He flinched but didn't wake. His skin was fire, his body surrendering to infection. She knew what had to be done. The slug was still inside. Working with the tip of her skinning knife, sterilized in the flame of a hastily built fire of sagebrush, she probed the wound. Her hands, calloused from farm work and hardship, were surprisingly steady. He cried out in his delirium as she finally coaxed the misshapen piece of lead from his flesh. She packed the wound with crushed creosote leaves, a trick she'd learned from an old prospector, and bound it tightly with more of her petticoat. He was still alive, his breathing a little deeper. But he couldn't stay here. The buzzards were a patient jury. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 5 and 20. His face, even slack with pain, held a harsh, unyielding beauty. There was a strength in the line of his jaw that even unconsciousness couldn't erase. Who was he? A raider? A hunter? A son? A husband? It didn't matter. She had interfered with his death. Now, by some unspoken law of the heart, she was responsible for his life. Using her rifle and a sturdy branch from the palo verde, she fashioned a crude travois. It was back-breaking work. Every pull of the rope, every knot tied, was a betrayal of Daniel's memory. She could almost hear his voice, full of loving exasperation. "Maeve, you'd give your last biscuit to a wolf if it looked hungry enough." She managed to heave the Apache onto the travois. The dead weight of him was immense, and for a moment she thought she would fail. But she set her jaw, looped the harness over her shoulders, and leaned into the weight. The desert floor grated under the poles. She took one step, then another. The sun beat down. She was walking east, away from Prescott, away from everything. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she was carrying a wounded Apache across the desert, and it was the heaviest burden she had ever known. The first 2 days were a blur of sun and suffering. Maeve's world shrank to the blistering patch of ground in front of her, the burning strain in her shoulders, and the rhythmic scrape of the travois poles. The Apache drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Sometimes he would murmur in a language she didn't understand, the words flowing like water, over stones, guttural yet strangely lyrical. At other times he would cry out, his body arching against the bindings as if fighting an unseen foe. During these episodes, Maeve would stop, dribble precious drops of water onto his cracked lips, and check his wound. The angry red around the edges was receding but slowly. The creosote was working, but the fever was a battle being fought deep inside him. She was his only ally, and she fought alongside him with a grim, silent determination. She learned the rhythm of his pain, the subtle shifts in his breathing that signaled a coming wave of agony. She learned the landscape of his face, the small crescent-shaped scar above his left eyebrow, the proud arch of his nose. She was tending to an enemy, yet the intimacy of the act was undeniable. She had touched his blood, felt the heat of his fever, and heard the unguarded sounds of his suffering. In this crucible of survival, the labels of settler and savage began to melt away, leaving only healer and wounded. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. She had stopped in the meager shade of a rock outcropping when she saw his eyes were open. This time they were clear. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. He watched her, his gaze steady and intense, making no move to speak or struggle. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering over the sand. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. The delirious patient was gone. In his place was a warrior. He was weak, yes, but the fire in his eyes was banked, not extinguished. She held her ground, meeting his gaze. She would not show fear. She had earned the right to be here. He slowly, deliberately pushed himself up onto his elbows. The effort cost him a sheen of sweat breaking out on his brow, but he did it. His eyes never left hers. Then he looked down at the clean bandage on his side, at the travois he lay upon, and finally back to her. He said nothing. The silence was a question. Maeve's throat was dry. "You had a bullet in you," she said, her voice hoarse. "Fever was taking you." He just watched her. His silence was unnerving, more potent than any threat. She realized he was assessing her, taking in her sunburnt face, her frayed dress, the rifle leaning against the rock. She offered him the canteen. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a strange jolt through her. He drank sparingly, a discipline that spoke of a life lived on the edge of thirst. He handed it back, his gaze still fixed on her. Then he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, but it held a surprising resonance. Why? The single word hung in the air between them. It was the question she had been asking herself for 3 days. Why save a man from the tribe that had destroyed her life? Why trade her own slim chance of survival for his, "I don't know," she answered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. He seemed to accept this. He lay back down, his eyes closing for a moment, as if gathering strength. For the rest of the day, a silent compact formed between them. When she stopped, he would sit up and take a little water and a few kernels of cornmeal she'd ground into a rough paste. He never complained. He never spoke again. But he watched. He watched the horizon, his eyes scanning the landscape with an unnerving focus. He watched the sky. He watched her. That night, as she sat by a tiny smokeless fire, he pushed a piece of dried meat into her hand. It was from a small pouch at his belt that she hadn't noticed. It was tough and leathery, but it was sustenance. She hadn't eaten anything but cornmeal in days. She nodded her thanks, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. They were two enemies bound by a wound and a strange unspoken debt. She had saved his life, and now he was sharing his meager rations to keep her strength up so she could continue to save him. The irony was as bitter as the desert wind, but as she chewed the tough jerky, watching him rest under a blanket of stars, the sharp edges of her hatred had begun to dull. Daniel's face was still a fresh wound in her soul, but for the first time she saw the man on the travois, not as a symbol of her loss, but as a fellow survivor in a land that was cruel to everyone. He had a name. She was sure of it. He had a family, a people. And as she pulled her shawl tighter against the chill, she realized with a jolt that she was taking him somewhere. But where was she taking him? To his death at the hands of her people, or to his life with his own? The question terrified her, because she no longer knew which outcome she wanted. 200 miles to the west, in the dusty, fly-blown town of Agua Fria, Bartholomew Bart, Corrigan spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the warped floorboards of the marshal's office. Corrigan was a man carved from gristle and greed. His eyes, the color of faded denim, missed nothing and forgave less. A livid scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent sneer etched into his face. He wasn't a lawman or an outlaw. He was a contractor of violence, and his specialty was Apache. "He's been seen," Corrigan said, his voice a low growl. He tossed a crumpled piece of paper onto the marshal's desk. It was a bounty notice, crudely printed, but with an impressive figure, $500. Gold coin. The marshal, a paunchy, sweat-stained man named Hobbs, peered at it. The sketch was rough, but the name was infamous in the territory. Nache Biehe. Hobbs read aloud a note of unease in his voice. "Delze's son, you're chasing him." "Chasing Marshal, no." Corrigan corrected a humorless smile, twisting his scarred face. "I'm collecting." He gestured to the two men standing behind him, Lyle and Pete, a pair of hard cases, who looked as if they'd been born squinting at a cruel sun. "We jumped him and his war party near the Dragoon Mountains. A tidy little ambush. Killed 3 of them. The rest scattered. But Nache, he took a slug from my sharps. A gut shot. He ran, but he's leaking. A man shot like that in this heat doesn't run far." Marshal Hobbs mopped his brow with a bandana. Chief Delze was a legend, a Chiricahua leader who had resisted both the Americans and the Mexicans with a cunning that bordered on supernatural. His son, Nache, was said to be even more formidable, not just a warrior, but a strategist, a ghost who moved through the mountains and deserts as if he were part of them. He wasn't just feared, he was respected, in a way that terrified men like Hobbes. To them, Nache represented the land itself, wild, untamable, and deadly. $500 is a lot of money, Bart, Hobbes said, trying to sound casual. But it won't do you much good if Delze's warriors find you first. They say Nachai is his father's shadow. A shadow with a hole in it, Corrigan sneered. He's alone and wounded. We tracked him for a day before the trail went cold on the rock flats. But there's only so many places to find water. He'll be making for the Gila River, or maybe holing up in some forgotten canyon. He's out there bleeding, and I aim to cash him in, piece by piece if I have to. Lyle, a tall, skeletal man with a nervous tic, shifted his weight. We lost the tracks, good Bart. Could be anywhere. He's an Apache, Lyle, not a god. Corrigan snapped his gaze, hardening. He bleeds, he thirsts, and he'll make a mistake. We'll pick up his trail again. We'll fan out. Check every dam, seep and spring between here and the border. Corrigan's obsession with Nache went beyond the bounty. A year ago, Nache had led a raid that had cost Corrigan a lucrative government contract for supplying beef to a fort. Nache hadn't just stolen the cattle, he had outsmarted Corrigan's men, led them on a fool's chase, and vanished into the Sierra Madre, making Corrigan a laughingstock. The bounty was business, but the hunt was personal. He wanted Nache's scalp hanging from his saddle. He turned and strode out of the office, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. Lyle and Pete followed like dogs at his heel. Outside, the sun was a malevolent eye in the sky. Corrigan mounted his horse, a big roan with a mean streak that matched its owner's. You boys head north toward the old mission ruins, he commanded. I'll take the trail east toward the Malpais. Look for broken twigs turned stones buzzards. Anything. A man shot like that can't hide his passing. He'll be leaving a trail of death behind him, even if it's just his own. As Corrigan rode out, his eyes scanned the vast, shimmering expanse of the desert. He pictured Nache, wounded and desperate, crawling through the scrub. He imagined the man's pride turning to fear as his strength ebbed away. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. He didn't know that his quarry was miles away, being dragged on a makeshift sled by a lone woman with haunted eyes. He didn't know that the trail he was looking for wasn't one of blood and desperation, but of something far more confounding, a stubborn, inexplicable act of mercy. But Corrigan was a patient hunter, and the desert always gave up its secrets one way or another. He would find the trail, and God help anyone who stood between him and his prize. For Maeve, the days bled into one another, each defined by the sun's punishing arc and the dull ache in her muscles. The man on the travois was growing stronger. She could see it in the way he moved, the clarity in his eyes. He now sat up for long periods, his gaze fixed on the surrounding terrain. He had begun to point, using curt, efficient gestures, to guide her toward easier paths to patches of land that were less rocky, or to almost invisible depressions in the ground where the shade might linger an hour longer. She followed his silent directions, an unspoken trust forming in the space between them. He still rarely spoke, the word water in his own tongue and a gesture. A nod of thanks for the cornmeal paste. But his silence was no longer threatening. It was watchful, contemplative. She found herself talking to him, filling the immense silence with the story of her life in Ireland, her voyage to America, the hopes she and Daniel had carried west. She spoke of their small farm, of the way the light hit the valley in the morning. She wasn't talking to an Apache. She was talking to a fellow soul trapped in purgatory with her. She never mentioned the raid. That was a wound too deep to touch. He would listen, his expression unchanging, but she felt his attention, a focused stillness that made her feel strangely less alone. One evening, the sky was a bruised purple and orange, and the air held a hint of coolness. She was tending to his wound, which was now clean, and healing the flesh knitting itself back together. "It will scar," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "But it will hold. You were lucky." He watched her hands, then looked at her face. "Maeve," he said. Her name. He had heard her say it in her one-sided conversations, and his pronunciation was careful, precise. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver through her. It made things real solid. He was no longer just the Apache, the wounded man. He was a person who knew her name. "And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What is your name?" He hesitated, his dark eyes searching hers as if weighing a great consequence. He looked out at the vast, darkening desert, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper, as if the name itself was a dangerous thing to release into the world. Nachai. The name meant nothing more to her. It was just a sound. She repeated it. "Nachai." He gave a single, sharp nod. Later that night, a memory surfaced unbidden. It was from months ago in Viridian's general store. A group of freighters had been talking, their voices low and tense. They spoke of raids of supply lines cut of a leader who moved like smoke and fought with the cunning of a coyote. A young war chief, they said, more dangerous than the old legends, because he understood the white man's ways. The name they'd spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect echoed in her mind. Nachai. The next day her unease grew. His name was a burr under a saddle blanket, irritating her, making her question everything. Was it the same man? It couldn't be. The territory was vast. The proof came in the form of a derelict way station, a crumbling adobe hut by a dried-up spring. It had been abandoned for years, but tacked to the inside of the doorframe faded, and peeling was a stack of old notices. One was a wanted poster from the U.S. Army. The paper was yellowed, the ink blurred by sun and time, but the sketch was unmistakable. It was him, the high cheekbones, the intense eyes, the scar above his brow, and beneath the drawing, the block letters wanted, for raids and depredation, Apache War Chief, Nachai son of Chief Delge, $500 reward, dead or alive. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. It was as if the ground had fallen away beneath her feet. This wasn't just any Apache warrior. This was a leader, a chief's son, a man worth a fortune, a man so feared that the army itself had put a price on his head. The stories were true. The man she had saved, the man who knew her name, the man whose life she held in her hands, was a legend. He was the enemy, not just of a few settlers, but of the entire United States government. She stumbled back out into the blinding sunlight, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nachai was watching her, his expression calm. He had seen her enter the station. He knew what she had found. His silence was now an admission. All the fragile trust she had built, all the shared moments of humanity evaporated in a wave of terror. She was harboring a notorious fugitive. The men who had shot him wouldn't just be random cowboys. They would be bounty hunters, trackers, killers, and they would still be looking for him. By helping him, she had made herself a target. She was no longer just a widow trying to survive. She was an accomplice. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a patient, not as a silent companion, but as Nachai, the feared son of Delze. And the name, which had been a simple sound just a day before, now felt like a rattlesnake coiled in the bottom of her stomach, ready to strike. She had a choice to make. She could leave him here. She could walk away, save herself, and let the desert or the bounty hunters finish the job. Or she could keep pulling the travois, dragging this terrible, dangerous secret with her deeper into a world from which there might be no return. The knowledge of Nache's identity changed the very air between them. It became taut, charged with unspoken things. Maeve's muscles were coiled with a new kind of tension, the fear of a hunter's bullet joining the familiar ache of exhaustion. She kept pulling the travois, her decision made in the silent terror outside the way station. To abandon him now felt like a different kind of murder. But the easy, one-sided conversations stopped. The silence returned heavier and more complicated than before. Nache seemed to understand. He was more alert than ever, his head constantly turning, his eyes sweeping the horizon. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a sentinel. He had healed enough to get off the travois for short periods, walking with a slight limp, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His strength was returning, and with it the aura of command that the bounty poster had only hinted at. Their path, guided by Nache, led them into a broken land of canyons and dry arroyos, a maze of rock that offered cover, but promised death to anyone who didn't know its secrets. It was here in the oppressive heat of a box canyon that they found him. He was an old prospector, his back against a rock, a cheap bottle of whiskey lying empty beside him. A dark stain on his chest told the story. He was dying, but his eyes were wide, with a feverish, terrified energy. When he saw Nache, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps panicked misidentification, crossed his face. You came back," the prospector rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. "Came back to finish the job." Maeve knelt beside him, offering her canteen, but he waved it away. Too late for that, missy. His gaze was locked on Nache. "We didn't do this," Maeve said softly. "We just found you." The old man coughed a terrible wet sound. "Corrigan. That devil Corrigan did this." He wheezed. "Said I saw too much. Said a dead partner tells no tales." He tried to laugh, but it turned into another rattling cough. "We were supposed to split it. The bounty." Maeve's blood ran cold. "Bounty! For the Apache!" The prospector gasped, his eyes wild. "For him." He gestured weakly toward Nache. "We jumped his camp. Bart Corrigan is a thorough man. He shot 'em all. But the prize, he got away." Nache stood motionless, his face an unreadable mask of stone, listening. "But that ain't all I saw," the old man whispered, his voice conspiratorial, his mind wandering in the haze of death. "Corrigan, he's clever. He knows how to stir the pot." He looked at Maeve, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "That settlement, Viridian, the O'Connell farmstead, that wasn't no Apache raid." Maeve froze, the world narrowing to the dying man's words. What did you say?" "Corrigan's work," the prospector croaked, his breath coming in shallow pants. "Him and his boys, dressed up, a few feathers, some paint. They did the burning, the killing. The army pays good for protection after a fresh raid, and it turns everyone against the Apache. Makes them easier to hunt. 2 birds, 1 stone, he said." The man's eyes rolled back. A final shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he was still. The silence that followed was absolute. Maeve knelt there, paralyzed, the prospector's words echoing in the canyon, shattering the foundations of her world. Viridian, the O'Connell farmstead. Daniel. It wasn't them. It wasn't the Apache. It was a lie. Her grief, the righteous, burning hatred that had fueled her for 6 months, was built on a lie. The men who had killed Daniel weren't the people she'd imagined. They were white men, greedy, cruel men, led by someone named Corrigan, the same man who was now hunting Nache. She slowly rose to her feet and turned to face Nache. His stoic mask had cracked. His eyes held a deep, profound sadness, not for himself, But for her, he had heard it all. He now understood the ghost that had been driving her, the source of the silent animosity she must have felt when she first found him. Corrigan, she said the name, tasting like poison. Nache nodded slowly. Bartholomew Corrigan. He said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. He wears the face of a snake. He has hunted my people for many seasons, always leaving the work of cowards in his wake. In that moment, everything shifted. The chasm between them of race, of culture, of grief closed. They were no longer settler and Apache rescuer and rescued. They were two people hunted by the same man, two souls whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by the same evil. Her quest for survival had suddenly become a quest for something else entirely. Justice. Or maybe just vengeance. She looked at the rifle leaning against the travois. It was Daniel's rifle. She picked it up, the weight of it familiar yet different. Before it had been a tool for survival. Now it felt like a promise. "He's hunting you," she said, her voice shaking with a cold rage she had never known. "Yes," Nache replied. "Then he is hunting us." The prospector's revelation had forged a new, dangerous alloy between Maeve and Nache. Their journey was no longer a desperate flight, but a calculated retreat. Nache, now fully in command of his senses, and his returning strength, took the lead. He was no longer guiding her to safety. He was guiding them both through his world, a world of subtle signs and hidden meanings. He read the land like a book Maeve had never known existed, a bent twig, a disturbed pebble. The flight of a hawk, each was a word, a sentence, a warning. He told her they were close to the foothills of the Sierra Madre, his people's stronghold. But Corrigan, he explained, would know this. He would expect them to take the most direct path. And Corrigan was like a persistent wolf. He would not give up the scent of blood. "He will push us," Nache said one evening, as they shared a small fire in a well-hidden rock shelter. "He will try to force us into a place where we have no escape. A trap." "Then we must not let him," Maeve replied, her hands busy cleaning the rifle. A grim smile touched Nache's lips. "No," he said, "we will let him. But it will be our trap, not his." He chose the place himself, a narrow, winding canyon, known to his people as Tse Biza, the mouth of the rock. It was a natural choke point. The walls were sheer and high, the floor littered with boulders that offered cover. There was only one way in and one way out. It was a perfect ambush site for whoever controlled the high ground. They arrived with half a day's light to spare. Nache, moving with a fluid grace that belied his recent injury, scaled a portion of the canyon wall, finding a ledge 40 feet up that was shrouded in shadow and offered a commanding view of the canyon floor. "You will stay here," he told Maeve, handing her the rifle and a small pouch of ammunition. "Corrigan will ride into the canyon. He will be arrogant. He will see the tracks leading in and think we are cornered. And you?" she asked, her heart pounding. "I will be the bait." The plan was terrifyingly simple. Nache would make his stand among the boulders at the far end of the canyon. Maeve's role was to be the surprise. From her perch, she could pin them down, create chaos, and turn Corrigan's confidence into a fatal mistake. "Do not show yourself until you hear my call," he instructed, his dark eyes intense. "It will be the cry of the grey hawk. When you hear it, shoot for the horses first. A man on foot in the open is a dead man." He clasped her shoulder for a moment, a gesture of profound trust. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows of the canyon floor. The weight was the hardest part. Maeve lay flat on the cold stone of the ledge, the Henry rifle heavy in her arms. The sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood and gold. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. She thought of Daniel, of the fire, of the lies that had defined her life for so long. The rage was still there, but it was a cold, focused thing now. This wasn't just for vengeance, it was for the truth. They came just as the shadows grew long. 3 riders silhouetted against the canyon's entrance. The man in the lead was unmistakable even from this distance. He was big, riding with a predator's slumped confidence. Corrigan. They rode in cautiously at first, then with growing assurance, as they followed the clear tracks Nache had left. Maeve could hear their voices echoing faintly off the rock walls. Like rats in a barrel, Corrigan's voice boomed. Nowhere left to run. They dismounted near the center of the canyon, spreading out rifles ready. They moved toward the boulder field, where Nache was concealed. Maeve held her breath, her finger resting on the trigger. The silence stretched. Suddenly a piercing cry echoed through the canyon. It was so perfect, so natural that for a second Maeve thought it was a real hawk. But it was the signal. She took a deep breath, sighted on the lead horse, Corrigan's big roan, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was deafening. The horse screamed and went down, kicking in a cloud of dust. Before the men could react, she livered another round and fired again. The second horse fell. The third panicked, broke its reins, and bolted back down the canyon. Chaos erupted. "Ambush up there!" One of the men yelled, firing blindly toward her ledge. Bullets sparked off the rock near her head, and she flattened herself, heart hammering. Down below, the trap was sprung. Nache rose from behind a boulder, not with a rifle but with a bow. An arrow hissed through the air and struck one of Corrigan's men, Lyle, in the throat. He gurgled and fell without a sound. Corrigan and his remaining man, Pete, dove for the cover of the fallen horses, firing wildly at both Nache's position and Maeve's. They were pinned. "It's the woman!" Corrigan roared in disbelief and fury. "The damn woman is with him!" Maeve reloaded her hands, shaking but her purpose clear. She wasn't a killer, but she would not let this man walk out of this canyon. She fired again, the bullet thudding into the dead horse Pete was using for cover. He yelped as splinters of bone and flesh struck his face. The battle became a deadly stalemate. The sun sank lower, plunging the canyon into deep shadow. Nache was a phantom among the rocks, loosing arrows from impossible angles. Corrigan was a cagey fighter, using the terrain, conserving his shots. Then Corrigan did something unexpected. He screamed her name. "O'Connell! Maeve O'Connell! I know who you are. You're helping the savage that killed your husband." The words were meant to poison her, to break her resolve, but they only hardened it. "You're a liar!" she screamed back, her voice raw. "Daniel's blood is on your hands." A shocked silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the wind. In that moment of hesitation, Nache moved. He broke cover, charging not at Corrigan, but at Pete. Before the man could bring his rifle around, Nache was on him, his knife flashing in the twilight. Corrigan saw his chance. His last man was dead, but Nache was exposed. He raised his sharps rifle, taking careful aim. Maeve saw it all from above. There was no time to reload, no time to think. She did the only thing she could. She stood up on the ledge, making herself a clear target, and screamed, "Corrigan!" He flinched. His head snapped up toward her, his instinct betraying his discipline. It was only for a second, but it was enough. An arrow sprouted from his chest, burying itself deep. He looked down at it, a comical expression of surprise on his scarred face. He staggered, fired his rifle into the sky, and then collapsed onto the dusty ground. Silence. The battle was over. Maeve slowly lowered the rifle, her body trembling with adrenaline and shock. Below, Nache stood over the body of his nemesis. He looked up at her ledge, a dark silhouette against the dying light. He raised a hand, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Their shared enemy was dead. They were for the moment free. They left the bodies for the coyotes and the buzzards. It was a harsh justice, but it was the justice of the desert, a land that wasted nothing, not even the husks of evil men. Maeve followed Nache out of the mouth of the rock, the ringing in her ears from the gunshots slowly fading, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the tall rock formations. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the violence. The woman who had left her burned-out homestead was a distant memory, a ghost shed like a snakeskin in the canyon. In her place stood someone harder, someone who had looked into the abyss and had not blinked. Their path turned upward, a steady, grueling climb out of the scorched lowlands. For 2 days they moved through a world that was slowly coming back to life. The air grew cooler, thinner, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine. The landscape softened from barren rock and skeletal cactus to sparse, hardy grasses and gnarled piñon trees that clung to the mountainsides with stubborn tenacity. This was Nache's home, and the change in him was as palpable as the changing elevation. The tense, watchful stillness he had carried across the desert eased from his shoulders. He moved with a new rhythm, a fluid confidence that spoke not of survival, but of belonging. He was a river returning to its source. On the afternoon of the second day, they crested a high ridge, and he stopped. He stood for a long moment, simply breathing the mountain air, his back to her. When he turned his face, held an expression she had never seen before, a quiet, profound peace. He gestured for her to come and stand beside him. Below them lay a sight so unexpected it stole her breath. Tucked between the grey, unforgiving peaks of the Sierra Madre was a hidden valley, a slash of impossible green carved into the stone. A thin stream, sparkling like a silver ribbon in the afternoon sun, meandered through its centre. Dotted along its banks were dozens of wickiups, the dome-shaped hide-and-branch dwellings of the Apache. Plumes of smoke curled lazily into the sky from small managed fires. In a meadow vibrant with wildflowers, a herd of horses grazed peacefully. The faint distant sound of children's laughter drifted up on the wind, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. After the brutal sepulchral silence of the desert, it was the sound of life itself. It was a sanctuary. As they began their slow descent down a winding, almost invisible trail, their appearance did not go unnoticed. A lone rider on a pinto, perched on a distant outcrop, raised a hand. An unseen signal was passed. Figures began to emerge from the camp below. They were warriors, moving with the silent, coordinated purpose of wolves. They fanned out their progress, swift and sure-footed, forming a loose, tightening cordon around the base of the trail. Maeve's brief sense of peace evaporated, replaced by a familiar, cold dread. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over her shoulder. Nache gave a slight shake of his head, a silent command to remain calm. When they reached the valley floor, the warriors closed in, forming a silent, intimidating circle around them. There were perhaps 20 of them, their faces stern and unreadable, their dark eyes fixed on Maeve. Those eyes held generations of suspicion and hostility. They saw her fair skin, her frayed dress, her alien features, and saw an intruder, the embodiment of the enemy who had stolen their lands and their people. An older warrior, his face a roadmap of dignity and sorrow. His hair streaked with grey, stepped forward. His gaze was sharp and imperious, and he ignored Maeve as if she were a rock or a tree, focusing entirely on Nache. He spoke in their native One tongue, his voice sharp with authority and layered with urgent questions. Nache stood tall, meeting the man's gaze with respect, but without deference. He replied, his own voice calm and authoritative, a leader addressing his people. He spoke for a long time, the lyrical, flowing words washing over Maeve. She watched as he gestured toward the healing wound in his side, then back toward the vast desert they had crossed. Finally, with a deliberate motion, he gestured to her. As he spoke, a murmur went through the assembled warriors. Their expressions, once so hard, shifted from raw aggression to a deep, wary confusion, and then to a grudging, astonished respect. They looked from Nache to Maeve and back again, seeing her now, not just as an enemy, but as a part of his incredible story. When he finished, a path cleared through the warriors. A man even older than the first approached. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, leaning lightly on a simple walking stick, yet his presence commanded the valley. His face was deeply lined, his eyes like chips of obsidian, holding a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. They were eyes that had seen everything: birth and death, peace and brutal war, triumph and profound loss. This, Maeve knew without being told, was the heart of this place, the center of their world. Nache turned to her, his voice low. "This is my father," he said simply. "Chief Delze." Delze finally turned his gaze on Maeve. It was an unnerving experience. He seemed to look right through her skin to weigh the contents of her soul. He saw not just her fear and exhaustion, but the stubborn resolve, the deep well of grief, and the ghosts that haunted her. He studied her for a long, silent minute before speaking to his son, his voice a low, rumbling bass. Nache translated. "My father asks why a white woman would save the life of a Chiricahua warrior. He says you have brought his son home, a thing for which his heart is grateful, but he doesn't understand your heart. He asks what price you paid for this." Maeve looked past Nache, directly at the stern chief. She was tired of fear of hatred born from ignorance and lies. She had to make him understand, not with a translator's words, but with the truth in her own eyes. "Tell him," she said, her voice clear and steady, "that when I found his son, I did not see a Chiricahua. I saw a man dying alone in the desert." She took a breath, the memory still raw. "My heart told me to help him. That is all." She paused, then met Delze's gaze again, letting him see the pain she had carried for so long. "Tell him the price was a lie. The man who killed my husband, who burned my home, was not Apache. His name was Bartholomew Corrigan." The name fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. A wave of recognition of shared hatred rippled through the warriors. Corrigan. They knew that name. They had bled because of that name. Nache translated her words, his voice tight with emotion. As Delze listened, a profound understanding dawned in his ancient eyes. The hard mask of the chief softened, revealing the weary wisdom of the man beneath. He looked from Maeve to his son, seeing the unbreakable bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of their shared ordeal. He spoke a few quiet, thoughtful words to Nache. "My father says that a heart that chooses mercy when it is filled with vengeance is a strong heart." Nache translated a note of pride in his voice. "He says the enemy of our enemy has shown us her spirit. You are welcome in this place. You will be safe here among us." Delze then spoke her new name, the woman who carries. The weeks that followed were a waking dream. Maeve lived in a world she had only known through the terrifying campfire stories of her own people. She saw the Apache not as faceless savages, but as families bound by intricate ties of kinship and tradition. She watched women tanning hides with practiced skill, their laughter soft as they worked. She saw children playing intricate games by the stream, their innocence a stark contrast to the harsh world outside their valley. She learned that a warrior, who was a fearsome protector in the mountains, could also be a gentle father, a loving husband. At first, they treated her with a cautious, respectful distance. But slowly, small bridges were built. One afternoon, a young mother whose toddler was suffering from a fever hesitantly allowed Maeve to prepare a tea of willow bark, a remedy her own grandmother had taught her. When the child's fever broke, the mother offered Maeve a silent, grateful nod and a piece of intricately beaded leather. Delze himself had watched from the door of his wickiup, his expression unreadable, but conveying a quiet approval. An older woman wordlessly sat with her one day and showed her how to grind sweet mesquite beans into a fine flour, a simple act of shared work that needed no language. She and Nashe rarely spoke of their journey. There was no need. The bond between them was deeper than words now forged in blood and dust, in shared survival and a common enemy. It wasn't a romance in the way her people would understand it. It was something more elemental, a profound respect, an unbreakable alliance of two souls who had seen the truth in each other. He was a chief's son, a future leader with the weight of his people on his shoulders. She was a ghost from another world, a woman with no people and no home. The chasm between their lives was as wide and deep as any canyon. One evening, as a spectacular sunset bled purple and orange across the western peaks, he came and stood beside her, where she watched from the edge of the valley. "The snow will come soon," he said, his voice a quiet murmur that didn't disturb the peace. "The passes will be closed. You can stay the winter. You will be safe." It was a generous offer, a promise of warmth and food and security in a world that had offered her none. But they both knew it was a temporary peace. She could not stay forever. This was his home, his life, his destiny. It was not hers. "And after the winter?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. "The world does not stand still," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening mountains. "My people will continue to fight for this land, for this life. Your people will continue to calm their hunger for land, like a fire that never dies. The war is not over. It is only resting." She knew he was right. Their journey together had been an impossible island of peace in a vast, raging ocean of war. She didn't belong here, and she could never go back to the world she had known. The truth she had learned in the desert had made her an outcast from her own kind, and she would forever be an outsider here. "I don't know where my trail leads now," she confessed the words a raw whisper. "I have no home to go back to, and no destination ahead." Nache turned to look at her, and in the twilight she saw a flicker of something close to sorrow in his dark eyes, a shared acknowledgement of their separate fates. "Sometimes," he said, his voice gentle, "the trail finds you. You do not need to see the end of it to take the first step. You carried me when I was helpless. You carried the truth of your husband's death. You are the woman who carries. You will find your own strength to cross whatever comes next." She looked out at the vast, wild land that stretched before them, a tapestry of shadow and fading light. He was right. She was no longer Maeve O'Connell, the grieving widow from Viridian. That woman had died in the dust with Daniel. A new woman had been born in the desert, baptized in violence and truth. Whatever the future held, whatever unknown canyons and sun-scorched plains she had yet to cross, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would be strong enough to carry it. Alone. The story of Maeve and Nache isn't written in any official history books. It's a tale whispered on the wind in the high desert canyons, a testament to the fact that the human heart can be a more treacherous and surprising landscape than any piece of territory. Theirs is a story about how the deepest enmities can be undone by a single act of compassion and how the truth once revealed can change not just a life, but the very meaning of survival. It reminds us that beneath the labels of settler and savage friend and foe, we are all just travelers searching for a safe place to rest in a world that is often cruel and unforgiving. Their trails diverged, but for a brief moment in the crucible of the Arizona desert, they walked as one. If this story of courage, truth, and the unlikely bonds forged in the Old West resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story that goes beyond the simple tales of heroes and villains. And for more deep dives into the dramatic, untold stories of the American frontier, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. There are countless stories buried in the dust of the past, waiting to be told.